foreign webinar on Pakistan's international trade competitiveness. On behalf of Learners Republic and Profit Magazine, I'd like to extend gratitude to all our panelists who have joined us. You've already read their introduction, but I'll just go through it quickly. Musaddiq Zulkarnain is Chairman Interdu. Shamim Rajani is IT entrepreneur and exporter. Shafiq Shahzad is Pakistan's Trade and Investment Minister in London. Gonzalo Varela is a senior trade economist at the World Bank. And Dr. Adil Nafada is Assistant Professor of Economics at IBA. Thank you so much. A few housekeeping rules before we begin. We will have 4 rounds in this webinar. In the first 3 rounds, I'll be posing questions to our panelists. I request them to answer within 3 minutes. In the last round, we will take questions from participants through the chat. Please keep your mics muted throughout this session and only share your questions along with suggested panelists who should answer your questions through the chat option. In the case of any disruption in the webinar, you can use the same link to join again. So now that we've got the house rules sorted out, let's begin the first round. The first round is basically an evaluation round where we're going to evaluate the current situation in terms of trade. So I'm going to start off with Musaddiq. So my first question is, as an entrepreneur, what trade and non-trade barriers do you think prevent Pakistan from gaining competitiveness?
Thank you, Riba. I think it's a good question, but I might need 3 hours to, answer this. But I'll try to, just list some bullet points in 3 minutes. First of all, we can split it into 2 types of barriers. Some of our own making, the internal domestic issues, and some of the trade barriers or non-trade barriers which on the external side we face. So on the external side, the biggest problem which Pakistan faces that we feel isolated. We are in none of the trade blocks like ASEAN or CAFTA or NAFTA. Even African countries now have trade preferences into Europe and into US and Canada. Pakistan has the only FTA where we have some leeway now is with China, but it's going to take a lot of time for us to really develop that market because of the competitiveness of the Chinese own manufacturers within China. Having said that, there is still some possibility of some exports into China. The only other preference we have is because of the GSP plus status into Europe. That is not a permanent thing. That is a very, very, short-term window for us. And countries like Vietnam have already, going into FTAs with Europe, and India is negotiating a FTA. So I think we are going to face a lot of problems. The only trade bloc we are in is SAARC, and we are the only country which is not able to take any advantage out of that. And we have some presence in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and those countries can take preference advantage of that with India and other exporting and importing goods at a duty-free status. But Pakistan, because of the certain issues we have with India, we don't enjoy that. So this is one of the biggest problems. The other external factor which we face from Pakistan is that unfortunately our trade routes are, very lengthy. The world is, world wants a very fast track speed on response to the consumer preferences. A ship moving out of China takes 2 weeks to reach US. We need at least 30 to 35 days because we don't have any direct vessels going. Our trade volume is very low. Those are the issues. Then we don't have ease of travel into Pakistan. For the customers to travel into Pakistan, come here and find a conducive environment, no matter what we say, they don't find the environment they need in Pakistan. We don't have enough exportable surplus, and because of that, the big retailers and brands, they don't have their offices in just a few, and those are sub offices. So most of the offices, hubs are either in Hong Kong or in Bangladesh, even in India. So it is very difficult for us to communicate with them, even travel, or when the buyers coming in. So these are the things. And now these are the issues which are related to the buyers or the retailers or which we have, or the customers. Now coming to the internal, and I'll then finish my, bullet points because I must be running out of time very soon. Unfortunately, we have not invested in our people. Though we have a huge surplus labor, we have never trained them. On average, for any work, the efficiency of our laborer is 3 to 2.5 times, 3 times less than that of a Chinese or equivalent person. I don't think there's anything wrong with our people. We have not invested in them. We have not trained them. We have not really tried to, you see, make them learn more and do more. The other thing is, obviously, we don't, as I said, we don't have enough capacities. We don't have exportable surplus. We need, if we need to, on a thumb rule basis, if we need to expand our exports by $20 billion, for example, we need an investment of $10 billion. So the government was, you see, looking into, and they had facilitated more investments by the domestic sector, by the local producers. But because of this COVID, this is all, you see, now up in the air. So we would need to do that, and we'll need to have a long-term policy from the government, because if the export sector is struggling every 6 months to, you see, get concessions and subsidies, that is not the solution. You have to have a long-term policy which is not based on subsidies, but based on efficiencies and performance, and on a fair level playing field within the country and with other you see, similar countries. So these are the barriers which we need to remove really if we want to do something about our exports. I think I must be out of my time, and so I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question is directed at Gonzalo. So based on the recent report, what are the structural loopholes that hamper Pakistan's trade potential?
Thank you. And thank you everyone for the invitation to this webinar. I would say if I have to pick three, three seems to be the magic number, so I'll pick three. There are three basic elements that are determining how successful Pakistan or Pakistani firms can be at exporting. And these are, the first is tariffs. So basically the import duties that are imposed on products that come into Pakistan. And one can think, okay, but import duties are imposed on imports, so why do they affect exports? So the point is that import duties are really an export duty in disguise. So whenever you're putting an import duty, what you're doing is you're discouraging a domestic firm from going global, from going into export markets, and you're encouraging that firm to take advantage of the protection that the import duty provides. And in Pakistan, import duties are extremely high. They are high in the international comparison, but they're also high when one compares with a highly protected region as South Asia. So just let me give you an example. If you look at the food processing sector in Pakistan, and if you take into account the import duties along the whole value chain, final and intermediates and raw materials, and you also take into account the amount of value they add, they face a 260% effective protection rate. So basically that provides no incentive whatsoever for firms in that sector in Pakistan to export. They will prefer to sell domestic. So that's item number one. Item number two, I would say, is the crucial element that is productivity. So the relationship between productivity and trade is a two-way street. You need to be productive to be able to export successfully. And as you export more, you become more productive. So what we see in Pakistan is that productivity is low, and the growth of productivity has also been low. So over the last 7 years, productivity growth has been about 2% per annum, which is about half of what we see in Bangladesh or what we see in India. And part of that is related to what the previous speaker was saying. There is very little investment in people. And let me link this to an indicator that is called capital deepening, that is basically by how much capital or machinery per worker increases in Pakistan, which is basically over the last 5 years, it has been brought to zero. So there is zero increase in the amount of machinery per worker in Pakistan, which is basically reducing productivity and preventing export. And the third thing to finalize is that export promotion is also very important to export successfully. The amount of information that firms have about foreign markets, about what it takes to get standards compliance, what it takes to find new clients. And this is something that needs substantial reform in Pakistan. That structure of export promotion needs to be modernized, needs to be made more smarter, be made IT, artificial intelligence, big data based. So I think these are three key elements: tariffs, productivity, and export promotion, that need to be ramped up in the case of tariff actually reduced, to bring trade to be a more prominent force for growth in Pakistan. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is directed at Chandana. What is the government strategy in terms of exports, in terms of export revival during COVID-19? You're on mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So thank you for that question. Thank you also, Dr. Saab, for inviting me. This is a very interesting panel so far. Perhaps I'll explain the background. Usually, and I think Shafiq Saab will talk about that particular portion. The government's trade promotion, primary trade promotion document is something called the STPF, the Strategic Trade Framework or Strategy. And this should have been 2018, 2023, the Strategic Trade Promotion Network framework. But we've not been able, for some reason, to finalize that. However, since I'm no longer the Parliamentary Secretary of Commerce, as of almost a year now, at this point, I'd resigned. So I'm not current with the document that is being prepared now. However, if you were to look a little bit at the budget figures, you'll see that the entire budget, one of the reasons, major reasons we put ourselves in a bind, the federal government, by imposing no new taxes is to ensure that this is a pro-business budget. So we're trying to stimulate spending on economic activity. Pre-budget, if you'll recall, there was a 1.24 trillion stimulus package that was announced by this government. 1/3 of it, a very small portion, in fact, less than 200 billion was directed towards COVID in itself, with the medical part of it, procurements and NDMA. 480 billion was targeted toward businesses. And out of that, a large chunk went to exporters so they can have liquidity back. And that's a huge issue. And it's a traditional issue always for our exporters. The other thing which we did was we gave a historic 50 billion package to, we don't call them MSMEs yet in Pakistan, we call them SMEs. There's another 50 billion package for agriculture, which is more or less non-existent. If you look at the budget of Sindh, government of Sindh, you're probably more aware than I am that agriculture and food are a provincial subject now. Yet the federal government has given 50 billion for promotion of agriculture products in Pakistan, responsible for food security, but looking at the export angle as well. Given that this is a COVID year and we have certain concerns due to artificial shortages and wheat, so being cautious on food exports, but that is somewhere you can have an exportable surplus. Let me just also clarify a little bit the ambit of legislature where exports are concerned. If you're the Minister for Trade and Commerce, that's a different thing. But if you're a regular parliamentarian, then you have your eye on a number of things. And you're looking at the for instance, we got 2 delegations on cost of doing business and ease of doing business. Mango exporters, PIA had raised rates, historic 500 or 550 rupees per kg for mangoes, for exports to the Gulf, and then to Canada and United States, 700 rupees per kg. Now, that is not, nobody's going to buy your mango at that rate. So when we spoke to the PIA and the minister, they said, well, since we're trying to compete with Emirates and Qatar, we decided to rack our rates. Now, that just shows you a basic lack of understanding. You do not raise competitiveness by raising your prices, you lower your prices. So that was taken care of, and PIA was incredibly helpful. They've slashed their rates to pre-budget, even less than pre-budget. We call them COVID rates. The other thing, that the Afghan border was sealed for trade. They were only trading 6 hours a day, 3 days a week. We opened up the border through NCOC yesterday for 7 days a week, 24 days. Now, that's the second part of what we legislators are doing to ensure that the roadblocks, the SPS, the Ts, the cost of doing business, ease of doing business, that is looked at in an emergency, the specific committee on agriculture products. The third thing we're doing is looking at long-term legislation. For this budget, it was pre-budget, and I was lucky enough to work with, while I was a consultant at Commerce Ministry, Shafiq Saab was there. I drafted our first GI law back in 2006 with billions of amendments. Now, finally, it is the law, and this is the final point, the e-commerce policy. I worked on that since 2015, and it's finally become something tangible. So I guess what I'm saying is the interest right now of the government of Pakistan is not necessarily so much on international exports, but the uncertainty due to the pandemic. You're facing the $9 trillion crunch. Now, trying to find a new market and a good product is not the easiest in normal times, so let alone in COVID times. So we're looking at making sure that we can stimulate the domestic commerce part of it, create a supply side capacity, because you know that for our agriculture, we face SPS and TBT problems, qualitative and standard issues. And on the exports, we just have 6 products. A 6-product basket is stifling this country. And we haven't moved beyond that in the last 40 years. So to create a market for niche products, as I said, difficult enough in normal times. To do that in COVID times is twice as hard. As I said, we have an SME stimulation package. We're going to see how we can do more on services, because historically that's been our strength, but I'll leave it at that now.
Thank you so much. All right, so our next question is directed at Shami. Textile goods and services, IT products and services. So in light of that, what impact on IT exports do you see following COVID? You're on mute.
Sorry, so can you guys hear me now? Awesome, thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me. So if you look at the IT sector as a whole, and thank you so much for Shandana Saiba's details. I had a good knowledge. Now I have a good knowledge about the strategic trade promotion framework, which I did not have a lot of knowledge about. So thank you so much for that. So if you look at the IT sector in general, it is very human centric, and capacity building is one of the major things that we work towards. Now, if you look at the last couple of months before pre-COVID, how the IT sector grew, there was a 24% growth in the last few months. And according to the SBP, on the official figures, there was a $1.06 billion in revenue in the last fiscal year. And unofficially, if you count it, it was a $3 billion around approximately dollars in the last fiscal year. So definitely IT is one of those sectors that should be in the limelight right now, should have a lot of focus. Now, if you look at the impact of COVID on the IT sector, Pakistan Software Association, PASHA, ran a report survey in March 2020. And according to that, 65% companies are uncertain about whether they'll be able to retain their employees in the next 3 to 6 months. And this is a survey around for 200 companies. On an average, the negative effect on revenue will be around 40 to 50% throughout the sector. Now, the sector-wise impact, if you talk with regard to IT, is travel, tourism, hospitality are all taking a downturn. Otherwise, sectors like BPO, support, tech, healthcare, and e-commerce are definitely seeing an upturn. Definitely, we are agreeing to that, and we do see an upturn in that. Now, given that the post-COVID situation where layoffs is going to definitely happen and is happening, and people are losing jobs, the budget that came out right now, and I'm only going to talk about my chunk, which is related to the IT and telecom sector. Out of the 6.6 billion, budget that was allocated to the IT and telecom sector, if you look at it, the majority share is for the telecom sector. So, like 535 billion for expansion of broadband services, 750 million for cellular, 709 million for 3G, 4G. So, when I was reading through this, and when people around the industry were reading through this, the problem that we have is, where did the chunk for the software export go? So if we are talking about capacity building, and if we are talking about exploring newer markets for this technology sector, we need to understand that IT and ITES is not just telecom. We need to focus on the export sector and allocate a proper budget for this. This in turn will definitely affect the IT sector. So yeah, I think to this question, that's where I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamim. The last question for this round is directed at Dr. Adil. A critical analysis of the budget and its impact from your side would be great.
1 second, just let me start my video. Okay, so I guess, okay. So let me start with this, the critical analysis. I'll go through some of the points that I have here. So first, what I see right now is that there's a more proactive involvement of the Ministry of Commerce in budget proposals as well as in the push for tariff reforms. Now, this was something that was missing in the past, as FBR had assumed a more prominent role in tariff implementation. In recent times, the Advisor for Commerce and Investment, as you have seen, has proposed the reduction of indirect taxes and increasing the proportion of direct taxes and revenue collection. So there was this national tariff policy that was released in November 2019, and which is a step in the right direction, I feel, as it highlights some independence of the MOC in tariff policy building, which is a very important step as it that will move away from what we saw say as tariff. So the focus right now for tariffs is for revenue generation. That is something that needs to change. And tariffs should not be, like the purpose of tariffs should not be that, right? So one of the major issues that Pakistan faces is that the large proportion of taxes collected are at import stages in total revenue. About 45% of revenue collected is at the import stage in Pakistan compared to 21% by India, 28% by Bangladesh, and 10% by the more developed countries. Now, this overdependence on custom duties and import stage tariffs has created challenges for exporters as well as local manufacturers, right? And increases the involvement of FBR in the tariff setting process and creates inefficiencies in production. This dependence on custom tariffs needs to be reduced, and the government needs to move from tariffs towards tackling non-tariff measures, right? So ensuring that the products that are imported into Pakistan meet standards and qualities that are at international level rather than so that we do not face these poor quality products that can likely to be dumped into Pakistan at times, right? But I feel that this journey itself is likely to be on a very bumpy road. So secondly, there has been certain relief provided to various sectors, such as exemption of various custom duties on zero-rated products, along with the provision of duty-free concessions on imports. So we see that industries such as chemicals, leather, textile, rubber, and fertilizers have received several concessions. Now, the budget says that 20% of all imports into Pakistan is expected to be duty-free. Right? Now, on the other hand, though, there is this issue with turnover tax and minimum tax that is happening, and that has often been raised as a big concern. So a lot of these groups have said about the minimum tax as well as cascading tariffs that are likely to create distortions and end up favoring larger integrated composite units that incorporate different stages of production within their own entity rather than SMEs. So the SMEs end up paying more for in terms of when these minimum taxes and turnover taxes are imposed, right? So that's what's costly and creates inefficiencies. Now, another thing that is always there, that is always talked about, is the prevalence of the SRO culture and the tax favors associated with it that have done damage to our smaller businesses. Makes the tax, so these SROs, they make the tariff structure very complex. And the idea should be that tariff concessions provided to industries must be envisioned with a long-term strategy in mind, so that their businesses availing such concessions can undertake long-term strategies and commitments with their investors rather than be subjected to these SROs and change in tax environment at the whims of the government official. Now, one thing amiss in the budget is the connection. Now, one thing that I see which is not there is the connection between these incentives provided by SBP and other sectors of the government and the FBR, right? So what they brought in the budget. So what I mean here is that SBR has provided significant relief to exporters and manufacturers under the Corona Relief Program. For instance, 8.6 billion was approved so far in refinance scheme for setting up new projects under its temporary economic relief facility, and rupees 107 billion has been so far approved for the refinance schemes under the Rozgar scheme. And then conditions on export finance scheme and long-term financing facilities have also been relaxed. But the federal government has also provided refunds to exporters. But again, what we should see is that a better integration in terms of the concessions offered by SBP and FBR. For example, those businesses availing concessions from SBP could have been provided with tax concessions on turnover taxes and sales, etc. as well. Right? So again, this could help incentivize documentation and improve tax collection in the end, because when businesses reach out to SBP, they have this other incentive of also reaching out to FBR, and then when it's better integrated, they would be better documented as well. So these things do matter in that sense, that the whole holistic approach should be taken into account rather than each department, government department acting separately. So I'll stop here. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I missed out on a question to Shafiq. The question is, what strategies are in the budget? What strategies are in the budget 2020 to 2021 that can help Pakistan in its trade competitiveness? And I'm sorry for skipping it.
Thank you so much. Most of the things have been stated by either Madam Chandana or Mr. Adil. Just few things I would like to add. Just picking up what Gonzalez said, that there are three areas which are hampering Pakistan's export competitiveness. So the government of Pakistan and Ministry of Commerce is trying to address these two things. One, the tariff issue has to a large extent been addressed in this budget. And as Mr. Adil said, first time the tariff policy has now been entrusted to Ministry of Commerce. And as a result of that, the ministry took all the stakeholders on board. And in this budget, we have recommended around 200 tariff lines on which duty slabs have been reduced. And likewise, in the last in the year 2019 as well, couple of tariff lines, especially raw materials on chemicals and fabrics, the duty was reduced in order to boost export competitiveness. And I hope that Ministry of Commerce will catch up with this, and in the coming years, the tariffs issue, since the ministry has always been, on this side of promotion of exports, this issue of tariff would be addressed to a large extent. The other part, export promotion, which Madam Chandana also said, that is generally addressed in the strategic trade policy framework. Ministry of Commerce is currently lagging behind because the policy was supposed to be announced last year, but still
You've gone on to mute. We can't.
Yes. So STPF, once this is announced, most of these trade promotion aspects would be covered in this strategic trade policy framework. There are many areas where we have to work on the product specification, on the marketing side, on expansion of markets, expansion of products. So these all areas will be addressed in the strategic trade policy framework. And the other thing, good part in this STPF is that this will not cover only the trade component of goods. The investment chapter has also been incorporated, taking incentives from the investment policy. So the effort is being made to integrate trade policy with the investment policy, and those in sectors would be incentivized, which will help promotion of Pakistan's exports and reduce reliance on the imports, which actually result in ballooning of the Pakistan's imports. With this, thank you so much. I think I've slightly covered this one.
Thank you so much. I request everyone to please mute yourselves. It's very disrespectful to the speaker if you're unmuted. So now we're going to begin round two. So in round two, we're talking more towards the future. So again, my first question is directed at Musaddiq. How do you see the future prospects for exports from Pakistan? Are you satisfied with the government strategy and budgetary measures to enhance exports?
Okay, Ariba, I think we should be mindful of what's going on in the world. As you might know, and everybody here would be aware, that according to the projections by all the international bodies, the global GDP is expected to shrink by around 6%, which is at least 4 times more than the 2009 crisis. Though some of the projections say that the world won't go back to pre-COVID situation till 2022. So that's 1.5 years away. Some analysis are saying that although the dip is to one of the worst in 70 years, the recovery is going to be fast as well. It's going to be brief. We still have to see. We don't know where the world is heading. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave or not, and how the markets have just started to open up. Similarly, in Pakistan, we don't know. We still don't know where the peak is going to be. We are totally unaware how we are going to manage it, whether it will be managed okay, or whether we'll have to go for more lockdowns. When the entire world is opening up, the demand is generating, would we be going back to lockdowns? So that is another topic. But this, you see, we should keep in mind to, you see, understand the future prospects. The main aim for any organization, or for that matter country, is to keep the companies solvent during this, whether they are for the domestic trade or whether they are for the international trade. We have to, you see, bear the pressures of COVID-19 and the resultant economic downturn for a prolonged period. It's not going to be over in a month or so. Even when you see the things will open up, there is going to be much reduced discretionary spend in the Western markets. Overall spend by the consumer is going to go down. So the demand is going to shrink. Keeping this in mind, I think our exports will stay in pressure. The only silver lining I see is that we have always been complaining that Pakistan, unfortunately, has been unable to move up the value chain. So we do most of our exports, because you see, about 60% of our exports are in textiles. And if you take textiles, we are at almost the bottom edge of the chain. We do very basic products. So that is the silver lining. The fashion is suffering more. There's more demand coming up for basics. So that is going to help us, which is, staying in basics is not a good thing in my point of view, but in these situations, we will be relatively better off, because the basics would sell more. The basics demand will still be there. Now coming. Is there an echo? I don't know why the echo is there. Anyhow, okay. Can you hear me, Reba? Can you hear me? Okay. So now coming to the budget and the budgetary measures to, you see, due to the COVID. I think Adil and Shafiq and Chandana had, you see, elaborated on that. Let me point out one thing. What I've seen is that as far as the advisor on commerce and the advisor on finance is concerned, they have been very receptive during the last few months. They have been very accessible. They have been trying their best to solve the issues, to understand the issues. And I must say that the Governor State Bank has been the most receptive. And having said that, the only benefit or the good scheme which has been, you see, given by this government and is by the State Bank, the Rozgar scheme, where they have helped a lot of enterprises with very, very low markup refinance in order to retain their employees. That is conditional to retain their employees for 3 months. And that has been, you see, modified and executed at a very fast pace. I've seen that if we have gone back to the governor with a certain anomaly in the scheme, it was rectified within hours, not days, within hours. So I've never seen SBP to work. So that I must commend that. Apart from that, to be honest, at least for the export sector, we have got nothing. No subsidy has been given. There has been a talk of, you see, 100 billion rupees. Those were refunds. And so far, as far I know, there are hundreds of billions of funds which are outstanding. We have been paid on as an export industry, about 30% of our refunds have been paid back. 70% is still outstanding, and that is not a subsidy. I'm not asking for a subsidy, but that is saying that it was part of the package. I think it is slightly exaggerating the whole issue. It's not that is a refund which is due. That's our money lying with the government, and it has to be paid back. Part of it has been paid back, and I hope the other will also be, so that the liquidity can be improved. Now coming to the present budget, I think that on tariffs, I would completely agree with Adil and Shafiq. I think what has happened is that as a policy, the tariff control has been given to the Commerce Ministry, where it shouldn't be. That's what the intention is, and I hope it is you see kept that way. That tariffs shouldn't be used to raise money. Tariffs should be, you see, is used to promote the domestic industry and the trade. And in this budget, we have seen that the emphasis has been on more value-added manufacturing. So the tariffs on the raw materials and the things needed by the value-added industry, whether it's domestic or it's export-oriented, has been brought down, which is a welcome step. Under normal circumstances, there have been no new taxes. That's a welcome step. If you say that it's a COVID budget, no, it's not. The world has seen $9 trillion of stimulus, the real stimulus. I know, I completely understand what should have happened and what could have been done are two different things. The government has a very little fiscal space unless they create that fiscal space. Now they are not going for taxes, so the fiscal space is not there. So either they have to cut down on the expenses, which we know probably not going to happen. So there's no fiscal space, or they have to talk to the IMF and probably seek more concession on the deficit side. First of all, I strongly fear that the figures given in the budget, I don't think they are realistic. You cannot, with no new taxation, with some tariff concessions, how can you raise $1 trillion rupees more? You cannot. So there has, either you'll have to cut down your spending, how much you can do. Maybe you can cut at 200 billion rupees from the development budget, which is not good, but then you will have to raise more taxes. So there is no doubt about that. There is going to be a mini budget. The government will be forced to do it. Or if they do go for more deficit financing, the inflation is going to go out of hand, and then the government's payout on the interest on their loans is going to go up. So it's a very difficult situation. But if we say that it's a COVID budget, no, we need a stimulus. It's not there. From where it's going to come, I don't know. But I think the corporations in Pakistan are going to struggle, and it will be difficult for them to stay solvent. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Gonzalo, the question is for you. What international examples could we follow to raise exports during COVID-19? We're stuck in this situation. So if 40% of tax is being collected through imports and we liberalize tariffs, how can we collect revenues then? And if you could please comment in light of the note of the import duties that you recently posted.
So there are several parts of this question, right? Let me start with the last part. That is, if there is a large portion of revenues that come from imports, then if we reduce those import duties, then what do we do? Okay, so that's a very important question. What we know from international experience is that as countries grow, become more developed, they move away from highly distortionary tariffs, right? Highly distortionary taxes like import duties, and they move into excise tax and they move into income tax, right? So GST, VAT, income tax. So there's sort of a pecking order of taxes from the most distortionary, those that you collect at the import stage, towards the least distortionary, and those that take a lot of capabilities to be able to collect, right? So it's easy to tax imports, and this is why less developed countries tax imports. They come at the border, and at the border, it's easy to control what comes in and what comes out. Still, there's smuggling, etc., but it's relatively easier. Now, the challenge is that as we move into later stages of development, we also need to be able to build capabilities to collect better taxes. So the challenge for Pakistan is building those capabilities to be able to move to less distortionary taxes, excise, VAT, GST, and eventually income tax. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. Now, then in terms of examples, what examples should Pakistan follow in terms of successful export strategies? What I would say here is, there is no one example that fits Pakistan. Pakistan is a different country than any other country in the world, and so it's difficult to find one. But I would say, look East Asia, right? And look at the experiences of East Asia. And one favorite example that I have is the example of Vietnam. And the example of Vietnam is quite good because, in 2000, Vietnam had a very similar export structure to the one of Pakistan. A lot of primary product exports, a lot of textiles. And if you fast forward to 2018, 2019, what you see is a extreme transformation of the export basket, and Vietnam starts exporting IT equipment, starts exporting computers, television sets, cameras, mobile phones, but it also exports textiles, and it also exports commodities and primary goods. How did Vietnam do that? Through something that the first speaker mentioned before, integrating into the global economy through trade agreements. So more trade agreements, integration with ASEAN, that was quite a good trade agreement, and attracting a lot of FDI. One in particular, Samsung. Samsung accounts for a large portion of the exports of Vietnam. So the challenge for Pakistan is not to follow one particular country's example. The challenge for Pakistan is to have a set of policies that are conducive to more competition and more upgrading. And that set of policies needs to include policies that boost productivity, policies that attract a lot of foreign direct investment that is efficiency seeking. So that foreign direct investment that wants to come to a country, to set shop in a country, to sell to the world, like Samsung did in Vietnam, like Microsoft did in Costa Rica. And this is something that is going to boost investment in Pakistan, is going to create more and better jobs, and it's something that is going to boost exports. But for that, you need the elements that I was mentioning before, a relatively open trade environment, because an efficiency-seeking multinational will want to be able to trade parts and components. You will need a lot of effort in terms of export promotion, because you need to make Pakistan an attractive destination for foreign companies to come. And I will add one more thing, that is, make it easy for foreigners to come into Pakistan. I am a foreigner. I can give you my own example. It is very difficult to get a visa to come into Pakistan. And if you want to get more FDI, you need to facilitate the process of visas. And I am cognizant of the fact that the process has become much better than it was, but it's still tough. And if you want in century 21 to have integration with the world economy, you need goods to move, you need ideas to move, but you also need people to move. So these are things that I think, rather than thinking, okay, what is the country example? I think the example should be in what are the concepts? We need to facilitate movement of people, movement of ideas, and movement of goods. I think that is going to help increasing exports. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. The next question is directed at Chandana. Do you think suppressing imports is enough as a strategy to keep the current account deficit in check?
Thank you, Reba. We've heard some really good things so far. It's funny, when we talk about trade, budgets, commerce and trade, the impression that usually goes out to non-specialists that there are these fine lines dividing the whole, but it isn't. Unfortunately, in this country, and I don't blame any political party, though I come from one, I've had the good luck or the bad luck to have worked with nearly 4 or 5 commerce ministers in an advisory capacity. The problem is the whole of the government approach is missing. And this is again coming from, because I bring to this particular discussion a political dimension, so I think it's important to mention that. For instance, the 18th Amendment. It's a very well thought out amendment in terms of what it does for democracy. What it didn't address was how you were going to do it. So you sent industry, labor, women, food, agriculture, all of that to the province. You kept commerce, exports, food security, and SMEs at the center. What you didn't do, and of course BOI, you have 1 federal BOI and 4 provincial BOI. You never figured out, by you, I mean, country, the people who were doing this work, a methodology whereby you can actually sit and talk with the provinces, because it's not Islamabad that produces anything, right? So this is by way of background, that the reason you see all these failures, in particular in the last 5 years, is not because it was known league. Your 18th Amendment didn't give directives on how to do what they wanted to. It's very important that the provinces look after industry, they raise the bar, they bring up productivity, they create niche products. But no, now of course one can say that the provincial government are children, we're not supposed to coddle them. But anytime there's such a huge devolution, you need to look after the process. And unfortunately, it wasn't looked after. Fair enough, it happened now. Since your question is very specific, I'm going to respond to that. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to read from my own notes, because I need to be sure I give you the right numbers. So If you'll recall, we've had a historic current account deficit as well as a trade deficit. And what it does to the economy, for those of us who are not that well versed, at least I wasn't, I was a trade person, I've fast had to become a finance person, is that it brings you at the risk of default. When you can't pay back your loans, what happens is you become like, God forbid, Venezuela. It takes you to Iran, thank God, because it has oil. Well, not in the current scenario, but before the pandemic, oil was giving a lot of stability, and because of the foreign exchange reserves to Iran, even though the growth was already in -3%. So you have these different dimensions that we don't have. But if I could just go to the CAD issue, the suppression of imports, a very flawed strategy if I were to talk as an economist. But since I'm not, I'm lucky enough I can make a political statement. It's the only tool we had at the time that we could bring down your burning house. We had to control your default. And the only way to do that was to bring down your imports. Now, when you do that, you're also bringing down the imports you need. You're bringing down machinery, you're bringing down raw materials, semi-finished goods, because as I said, there's no fine line in economics. It's not like a science. So there was a price to be paid. There would have been repercussions, but we needed to bring down our house in order. So we brought it down from 6% of GDP, the CAD, to right now under 2.5% in 29-20. Now, it's not enough. We also need to increase our exports. But as I told you in my earlier question, and this is where this sort of dovetails, that to increase your exports in regular times is difficult when you're not as competitive as your Vietnam, as your Chinese, as your Thailand, as your Philippines. So you have a competitiveness problem. And then, as many of our colleagues already mentioned, if you look at the World Bank indicators on world governance indicators, that's one of the biggest barriers to FDI in Pakistan. So how will you increase your exports if you don't have local financing? And that, again, is another problem. You have one of the best investment policies in the world. Brazil, by the way, doesn't have any BITs, and they get far more investment than we do with all the BITs we have. Starting in 1960-something, with the first one was with Germany. Now, by the way, Indonesia and South Africa in the process of scrapping their BITs as well, but that's a different story. So, to increase your exports, the government is also, again, this has been mentioned, we're trying to reduce entire tariff line duty. So on raw materials, of course, some people in the country are upset that you are now dispersing your local raw material industry. But again, these are COVID times. You need tough times call for tough measures. May not be the most perfect solution, but it is for the moment something done for the first time to absolutely remove the duties on import of raw materials. The idea has been that what is not available locally, we import that. However, private sector, the main issue in CAT, one is suppression of imports, the other is increase of exports. But until and unless the private sector steps up, look, we talk about the GSP plus. GSP plus is for 10 years. That's longer than short term. That's not long term in terms of 20 or 30 years, but it's longer than short term, it's longer than medium term. 2 terms of government. That should have prompted the private sector to do certain things, which they didn't do, and that's where my disappointment lies. If you recall, JCPenney, Walmart, Disney, and a couple of others pulled out of Pakistan because of poor governance by the private sector. So I think the private sector in Pakistan still doesn't understand that while it is the government's job to bring you preferences, to bring you lower tariffs in international export markets, to help you with your marketing, the government has no business being in business. We cannot be, you look at PIA, you look at the steel mills, you look at the PMTF, there's a prime examples of how governments have failed. State-owned enterprises will fail eventually. Unless you're like Germany, you will fail. So I think the lesson here is that in Pakistan, nobody talks about the private sector failures. The focus is so much on the government mismanagement that we forget that this is the same nation of people. You don't import your government officials from anywhere. They're the same Pakistanis who work in the private sector, who work in the military, who work in the media, who work in the private sector. You need to overhaul this entire mindset of the business sector as well. There's plenty I can say more, but I don't know if that will be relevant for my question. I do have a couple of points on the e-commerce policy, but perhaps I'll save it for the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shafiq, the next question is directed at you. Pakistan has signed a lot of FTAs. We don't end up exporting though. We end up importing palm oil, Indonesia and Malaysia के साथ जो हमारा the FTA, does the Ministry of Commerce actually look at data after signing and develop a strategy, keeping in mind whether we get net benefit or not? And what is the role of the commerce attaché, and how do you see your role? And what role do you play?
Thank you so much. It's quite a large question, so I'll rephrase it. Rather, I'll break it into two parts. One, what we have done so far on FTAs and PTAs. Musaddiq Saab also alluded to this part. The second part I'll cover is the where we are lacking behind. And the third question is about the commercial attaché's role. I'll come to that in the end. The first one, what we have done so far. I mean, everybody is quite aware of that. We are having a couple of FTAs, but not to that level. I mean, next door neighbor, India, considered to be a closed economy, having many FTAs, Thailand, and East Asia is going into plethora of FTAs and PTAs all around the globe. We signed first part of the China-Pakistan FTA. Yes, that resulted in increase in imports. We cannot attribute all the imports because of China FTA, because in 16-17 major imports took place because of CPAC. So that basically contributed to rise in imports from China. But what we did, we started second phase in 2012 and concluded in 2019. So it took us almost 7 years. And I can vouch for that, that this is the best deal that any country can clinch from a country like China. Like Chinese total global imports, roughly $2 trillion US, and 85% of their imports are duty-free for Pakistan. So it's a huge market where they are relocating, where they are graduating upwards, they are sophisticating their productions, and still there is huge demand. So we have dovetailed, we have got major concessions in the Chinese market, and not only concessions we have sought, we on the other hand have been able to protect our industry through very stringent safeguard measures as well. Sorry. The other one, I'll cut it short. The other one that you said was the Indonesia and Malaysia PTA. Yes, that resulted in increasing imports, but palm oil, they are the major producer. Pakistan has traditionally been importing palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia. What we did was there was a slightly, ministry didn't do well at that point in time, because we did first FTA with Malaysia, we gave them concessions, and then same concession was given to Indonesia without getting something in tangible in return. And as a result, the imports of palm oil was diverted to Indonesia. What we ministry did in 2017-18, when we analyzed that, we took up this issue. We even went to the extent of revoking this PTA. And ultimately, after 2-3 rounds of negotiations, we were able to seek major concessions again from Indonesia. We didn't concede anything. We call it a rectification of the first PTA and 20 top export tariff lines, for which Pakistan's global exports is roughly $8 billion US. We have been able to get zero duty, and this notification has been issued and is operational. With Sri Lanka, we have been enjoying trade surplus. Now, where we are lacking, Musaddiq Saab said, and yes, there are many FTAs going on. The famous one is ASEAN +6 FTA, which ASEAN is negotiating with countries like China, India, Australia, New Zealand. Pakistan is not part of that. Once this FTA, this comprehensive FTA is signed, Pakistan will be completely out of this Far East market, because they are going to massively reduce their tariffs. Courtesy India, that India is still blocking that and trying to negotiate on its own terms. Had India been agreed to, this would have been signed last year, because 2019 was the deadline for that. We have a problem. We cannot, at this point in time, become part of RCEP, because we have never been part of the full dialogue partnership with ASEAN, and that is the reason we cannot negotiate that. TPP is another famous agreement. Trump withdrew from that, but still they are heading, towards conclusion, and they have rephrased the name. They call it Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement. And now UK with Brexit is considering also to be part of that. We have not even given any consent, or not been even considered by those countries to, co-opt Pakistan, considering Pakistan may not be a big market for them. GSP plus, yes, these are time-bound concessions available to Pakistan, but as Madam Chandana said, I was looking at UK, imports. After 6 years of GSP plus, our exports to UK just increased by 400 million, which is a peanut. So if we are not ready for that, and once this GSP is graduated or they phase out, where do we stand? This is the time that our exporters and entrepreneurs should take advantage of that. We are at par with Bangladesh and many of the developing countries. If we are not able to, compete at this point in time, imagine when they will put in tariffs and what would happen after that. With UK, we actively engaging them, and hopefully, Musaddiq Saab, they will give GSP-like concessions to Pakistan for some period in time. But again, we have to go for a long-term sustainable institutional mechanism, not just relying on the unilateral concessions, maybe reciprocity, and maybe we have to move towards some free trade agreement, which are, continuous long-term agreements. Just alluding to the previous question, what we are supposed to do and what we have inferred out of this COVID are just 3-4 points I would like to highlight. One is the COVID, what I have noticed globally, 3-4 new phenomena have emerged. One is the rise of e-commerce. E-commerce is on the rise despite these lockdowns. All these eBays and Amazons and all these online selling shops, their sales have ballooned. So we have to, work on that, and our exporters and other even IT industry, they have to come into this. The other one is the rise of food products demand globally is on the rise. And that is the reason that despite this stock piling, the global trade and the livelihood remained, people were not starving because of this COVID. The other point, maybe Shandana can think about that. There's a huge demand of PP products globally, but Pakistan has imposed a ban on exports and has just been recently, lifted. There was a time that countries like Turkey, China, and Bangladesh, they have ventured into this market and they have started producing all PPE, the trade of which is going exponentially high. But due to, our domestic reasons, we have not been able to, lift a ban on exports, which should have been done earlier. As regards to commercial attaches, we have, as everybody said, we have a very, limited room to work. We rely on the Pakistan's, domestic supply side. And on many areas, we are constrained because of the supply issues. Madam Shandana just said the mango, we have not been able to import in UK recently because we don't have PIA flights regularly. And even if there are flights, the freight is exorbitantly high that we are not able to even compete with Indian or other, wages suppliers. So despite all that, we are trying to, put up the best show in these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. The next question goes out to Shamim. What are the ways in which the IT industry can find a level playing field with the world to compete in terms of trade?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll go back to a couple of things that the previous panelists put a very good light on. So like Musaddiq Saab said, that the consumer market is shrinking. Absolutely, it is shrinking. But is it shrinking for the tech domain? No, it's not. It's shrinking for the other industry, but it is going up. It's becoming bigger for the tech industry. So like the last panelist said, the e-commerce is taking a hype, globally and within Pakistan. So tech exports can and will go higher because everything around the world is going online. So now is the time to focus on the tech industry. Now, before I tell you, what are ways that the IT industry can level play, I'll also tell you, I want to put light on a couple of very recent events that have actually pushed us back rather than pushing us forward. Even though the global market looks very lucrative for the IT industry, there are a couple of instances that have happened in the last few weeks that have actually pushed us back. So let's talk about the SBP refinance scheme that Musaddiq Saab mentioned. Amazing scheme, very good. Even for the tech industry, they are giving out finances on soft assets, so intangible collateral, which is a really good initiative by the SBP. Now, even having said so, the tech industry is not able to leverage on it. Why is that? Because the intermediary banks in between would not. So they are still working on the KYCs, know your customer, focus processes, and they're still not getting those loans out. So even though that the SVP has given out hotlines and email addresses, I know of very few IT industry people who have been able to actually leverage from this SBP refinance scheme, which is going to end towards the end of June. So that's one thing. One of the other problems is that now more than ever, the IT industry relies on infrastructure because everybody is working from home. Now was not the time to block IPs or to focus towards IP whitelisting. Now was not the time to focus towards VPN registrations, and we would block it by 30th June if people don't register, or block VoIP. That's what the Pakistani government or the public sector is doing at this point, where we are at the verge of actually growing the freelance market, growing the tech market, and these are the problems that we are facing, and having to go back and work with the public sector and talk to them and educate them why this is not the time to do so. So having said, and we highlighted some of these problems, definitely if you want to compete in terms of trade, the first and foremost important thing is to have the right representation on the global front. Like Musaddiq Saab said very early, to push the Pakistan tech industry up. So if you look in the global arena, I know that Pakistan has very poor representation, but IT has the least representation. So Pakistan is still considered as an agricultural country rather than a country that is producing not only producing good IT services, products, but also individuals. Like I said, 24% growth in the last few months, even having COVID in place. So yeah. So we also need to make sure that we have representatives who understand this ecosystem and the importance of taking it seriously. The other thing I think should be not just being there or being present there, but also lobbying on the global front. Government should be able to attract international players into the local market for investment in Pakistan. Like Gonzalo said, that we need investment in Pakistan, and for that we need to be able to attract the right kind of players. And to attract them, we need the right policies in place, and create a trade conducive and ecosystem, not just for the IT industry, but for everybody. The other thing is exposing the local companies with the foreign market. So educating the local players in the industry what the foreign market looks like and making them market ready. That is also very important. The next point that I would like to focus on is public-private partnerships. Now, this has been a pain point for the tech industry for a very long time. Just very recently, so the public sector should encourage partnerships with the private sector and hire local industry to build not just their products, but also not give out projects to international players, and when there is local potential in the market. So very recently, the COVID app, if you know, was built in-house by the NITB, and we all know, if you've been following the social media, how I wouldn't use the word embarrassment, but it was a setback for the industry itself and for the COVID initiative itself. Had it been given to a private partner, I'm sure we would have done an excellent job, because we do this every day for everybody around the world, except for Pakistan, except for the private sector of Pakistan. The other point that I want to focus on is skill development. Online training is very, very important, not just in the tech sector, but everywhere. But I'm going to be very specific about the tech sector. We have been, as the private sector, been working in silos and training our people. But the government needs to come in and basically mitigate the gap between the academic and the private and the industry. And I understand what Chandana Saiba is saying, that the private sector also needs to step up. And madam, we are stepping up. We are creating training centers to train these people, so to bring them at par with the industry. But my point is, the IT industry is a very small, part of the whole ecosystem, and we need government support to make it happen on a larger scale. We can do it in silos, we can do it in our own bubbles, but we need the government support to make it happen. And then again, as a last point, I would say that, apart from that, we also need to have the right policies around diversity and inclusion, especially in the tech domain. Again, 48.6% women in Pakistan. We can actually train those women and the minority on, even if they're not IT graduates, we can train them on for low-end projects, for smaller jobs that they can do, and we can bring that work to Pakistan. The problem is having the right policies in place so that Pasha or the trade association can actually enforce them on the private sector. So yeah, that's something I would just wanted to add. Thank you.
I think Ariba ki jo hai, wo load
can I just
shedding
respond
ho gayi hai.
quickly, please?
Yeah,
Ariba,
you can.
till Ariba's not here, I want to quickly respond to something Shamim Bibi said. Thank you so much. First of all, my comment was actually not directed at the tech industry. It was more towards manufacturing and industry, because they tend to get the lion's share of subsidies. They tend to get the lion's share of policy documents. So no, in fact, for the e-commerce policy, my biggest frustration was when I was working on this. Our biggest impediments, we work with the cross section of Pakistan's online, businesses, and just a few. Food Panda, Yevo, Daraz, that were the other two. And what we discovered at the end, at the time that I left the ministry and joined the parliament, was that FBR and the provinces were having trouble in the sales tax arena, specifically because sales tax on services had been given to the provinces. And Sindh was in a funny position. They were doing double taxation. I talked to some of the SPR people, and they said that, ma'am, ye to hamara avenue hai, ye humne karna. I said, that's fine, but you can't be tax consumer at the point of consumption and for the same product and for the same transaction as you are doing at the point of departure or where the product is being bought. Similar for example, income tax on consultants who would pay a flat rate of 10% on any consultancy, whether it be IT or anything else. If you're selling a report online to a country, now you pay double tax on that in some zones in Pakistan. So that was our first problem, trying to get FBR and the provincial revenue authorities to actually agree to making it easier to do business in Pakistan. And the second problem we had was with State Bank, and I think that problem has yet not been resolved, of the international payment gateway. Your eBays, your Amazons, your PayPal, they don't want to come to Pakistan because State Bank, and for reasons understandable, but you have to move beyond those reasons. State Bank wants to count every dollar moving in and out of Pakistan. That's not helpful. So for IT sector, I completely understand one sector where the government has not been the most useful in terms of either subsidies or support, and you guys have done more than anybody else. And I'm cognizant of that. So just to make sure that you understood my, not criticism, but my feedback on the private sector. Thank you.
So much, I understand that.
Yeah. So Adil, I have a question for you. So Ariba wrote this question for you, your student, but she has disappeared due to load shedding.
Okay, it's all right. Yes.
So I'm just reading that question that your student has.
My power went out.
Ah, yeah. Okay. So are you back?
I'm on from my phone now.
Okay. So you can have this question for Adil, I think.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so the question is, the overvaluation of the rupee and the anti-export bias have hurt our exports. So if you could shed some light on the export situation in Pakistan in the last decade, and what the major trend at the product level was, and how has COVID-19 impacted this trend?
Okay, thank you for the question, Ariba. So yeah, let me start first with explaining the dire picture of export performance between 2011 and 2018. So I had data till 2018, so that's why I'm choosing that. So Pakistan was one of the worst performing countries in terms of its exports among lower and low middle income countries between 2011 and 2018. Now, the export as a percentage of GDP was at 8%, and it was one of the lowest in the world, unfortunately. More importantly, only a handful of countries, with Pakistan as one of them, reported negative growth rates for their exports during this period. Overvalued currency, along with uncertainty in tariff rates, created this anti-export bias, right, which penalized exporters. And you saw that several exporters in Pakistan shifted their sales towards the domestic retail market. So we saw that the domestic retail market grew exponentially during this period, while the exporters were shifting away from exporting towards the local market. The anti-export bias, with policies discouraging exports in the last 10 years, resulted in low level of investments in productive manufacturing activities that could boost exports. We saw little investment even in textile industry. We did not see the kind of investment that would actually lead to export growth once the currency did depreciate, right? So this lack of additional capacity limited export growth when the currency did depreciate. Although other constraints such as security, energy, etc., were improved and were during the latter part of the decade, the growth in exports did not increase as much as was expected, more from the depreciation that took place. Again, why was that? The reason was that the exporters were at full capacity during the 2017 period where the depreciation had happened. And because they had not taken any BMR, they undertaken much BMR prior to the depreciation, the export growth itself was highly constrained and could have been much better. Now, another issue is that Pakistan focuses on the exports of products that have stagnated in terms of their world import demand. For instance, the global demand for textiles and leather products have grown at only 1% annually during this period, while that for vehicles and machinery has grown at 3% annually between 2011 and 2018. So the export basket that we have is low valued, but not only is it that, it doesn't have the import demand growth that we see in other products. The demand for value-added consumer goods now, even within textile as well as leather products, right? The value-added, the made-up textile products, the apparels, the leather articles, they have increased at more than 2% annually during that period. But on the other hand, the counter side is that the demand for cotton inputs in the world, right? So the cotton inputs world is moving away from cotton inputs towards man-made fiber. We saw that. And there was this bigger push in the last decade. And because of that, the demand for cotton inputs has decreased at more than 3% annually during this period. Therefore, the focus must shift towards value addition in exports, also towards making sure that the right input mix is being used in our production that the world demands, right? Now, let me go to the COVID-19 impact on exports and try to answer that. So the textile industry, everybody knows, has been significantly impacted by the decline in exports due to COVID-19. Knitwear and bedwear have decreased by more than 50% in year-on-year exports between March and May 2020. That was a big jump. The recovery that we saw in 2019, that was highly negated, right? So when we saw the fall due to the COVID impact. So for textile products was almost reversed. Ready-made garments increased at 12% between July and February this fiscal year, up till February and March, up to February 2020, we saw a large increase, a large spike in the ready-made garments at 12%, but then again, it dropped more than 40% in the previous 3 months during this COVID crisis. The sharp decline is a result of the extended lockdown, again, in both in EU and US, as well as the lockdown that we have in Pakistan, right? And because of the lockdown, etc., the impact on the exporters is that now they're facing a liquidity crunch and they're having further problems because the orders are getting delayed and they cannot finance. So they rely on the subsidies and the government financing facilities, the schemes that the various governments have provided. That becomes extremely critical during this time. Now, there are a handful of products in which Pakistan is said to have decent competitive advantage as well as cost advantage in terms of unit values of exports, right? So if we count on the fingers, we could actually do that, right? So for majority of the products exported, Pakistan faces stringent competition from regional counterparts. It is likely that our competitors are as likely to receive concessions from their own governments. So something like China and India, naturally, they will also come up and give concessions to their exporters and make it more difficult for our exporters to compete because China and India also want their exports to revive, right? So this whole thing that we are not alone in this, right? But because of that, you're also facing this issues that other governments will also prop up their exporters. So what does the government need to do? Now it needs to step up its effect of lowering costs of production, reducing business constraints, and all that. It has to become much more intense. The lost contracts of a large proportion of exporters will need to be won again, and trading relations will need to be reestablished, right? That's what we have discussed in this. However, there will be certain businesses that need immediate relief due to the nature of their product. So again, what will happen here is that there will be some businesses which are now more naturally sensitive to COVID crisis than other businesses, and that analysis needs to be done. That is where governments will need to become more foresighted in their approach, right? So that's what we'll see. So yeah, I'll end with this, and thank you for the question again.
All right, thank you for the answer. We're now moving on to round 3, and the first question goes from Musaddiq. What are some commodities or services you feel Pakistan has an edge over, and how do you suggest we use them?
I'd request the panel members to keep the answers short, considering how we're restricted on time.
Okay, Ariba, thank you. First of all, I would like to comment on what Shandana mentioned about the private sector. I think I absolutely agree with her. I think I have always been of the view that it's not just the government, the private sector has to come up and do their own thing, put their house in order. No two questions about that. But having said that, let me correct one thing. She did mention that JCPenney, Walmart, and Walt Disney pulled out because of the administrative issues here. I think it was just Walt Disney which pulled out, which obviously was a disaster because of the issues. But Walmart and JCPenney are still here, and that doesn't mean that our house is in order. But no, they are still here. Walmart and JCPenney are still here. Now, coming back to your question, I think there is, first of all, let's understand there's not going to be a quick fix. We need a long-term sustained policy, and probably it cannot come from one political government. We need to have a consensus amongst all the political forces of this country to have a 5 to 10 years plan where we build our exports, because without building our exports, you will always be going back into a current account deficit issues, because our growth is dependent, as Shandana very rightly said, our growth is dependent on imports. And if we want to increase the imports, we have to increase our exports to counter that. Having said that, again, I would like to quickly mention what Adil said. I would like to slightly disagree with him that the textile has no sufficient room. Yes, it's not growing, but Pakistan's share has shrunk to just under 1% or 1% of the global trade. We have a lot of room. Yes, we have to move up the value chain. The importance of textile sector is because it has the ability to employ millions and millions of people. In the initial 5 to 10 years, you can't really do away with the sector which can provide employment to so many people. But now coming to what are the prospects? So let's look what is our real strength in this country, which can also become a big problem for us if we don't address that. That is our youth. We are over 60%, 65% youth. One of the biggest youth bulge we have in the world. And if we train them right, we can really use them, put to very good use. I think Shami was very right to point out that we have not paid enough attention to our services, IT and any other services. Our services exports have been dismal. While even in our region, they are much better than us. We could really, the government has to, and the private sector has to come up with a long-term plan where we not only support the IT services, we can have health tourism. We can have many other services which can be, brought in using our youth, train them for the right jobs, train them for those things, and it would take 2 to 3 years to start picking up. I think without promoting our services, will never be able to catch up. So that is one area which has been neglected very badly, and because we have such a vast majority of youth unemployed, I was looking at the Twitter for the last 2 days, and people were happy, and I'm really happy for them, for all the candidates, and I can see Naveed already smiling, knowing what I'm going to say. The candidates who've done very well and have been selected in CSS. Some of them are, postgraduates. Some of them are doctors, which is good. I'm very happy for them. But why are we not able to provide opportunities to those people? They don't see prospects here. So that the only way left for them is to go to CSS. So I think there is a lot of room. That's what the other area where I think we can have a long-term prospect is the agri sector. If you look at our exports, in the first 11 months we have been able to export $19.8 billion of goods, which is 6% less than the last year because of the various reasons. Out of that, $16 billion came from textiles and our food category. But in food category, our vegetables, our fruits, our meat and processed meat is dismal. We don't need too much of land. We just need a proper emphasis, proper policy. And I think Shandana was right in that sense that we do have problems because of the devolution to provinces. But I think that is the role of the government to bring everybody on the table and to have a national policy on that. And we need to promote our agricultural exports. We have a Middle East market. We have Chinese market. They need a lot of things. I was just exploring for certain project, and Saudi, for example, Saudi Arabia has now banned any fodder you see growing in their fields for the dairy farms because they don't want to use their water. So all the Middle East, it's a big market for the food, which we have not been able to tap. We have not been able to tap the meat processing. We have big meat processing units, but we have not used that. So I think we can, and on top of that, I think as it was pointed out, we have not, you see, been able to bring in investment for high-tech industry, for cell phones, for further appliances, for consumer goods. We do have a base for engineering goods exports also. So I think we need a long-term policy where besides moving up the value chain for textiles, we have to develop our services, our agri sector, and some value-added products gradually into, and we have to have a 5 to 10 year strategy for that. It can't be done in 1 year or one budget or two, and then we have to sustain that policy to be able to, you see, increase our exports. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. The next question is for Gonzalo. There's a general trend to consider imports as harmful for the economy. Would you say import-led growth has worked for any other economy in the long run?
Good question. So I don't think there's such a thing as import-led growth, but also I don't think imports are a bad thing for the economy. Imports are a good thing for the economy. Imports are good for consumers of one variety, but most importantly, and in the case of Pakistan, imports are good for industry. If you look at the composition of imports in Pakistan, 90% or 85 to 90% of imports in Pakistan are for industrial use or business use. So it's only 15% of the imports that are consumed by, you know, you and me, consumers in general. The bulk of imports are used by factories, by businesses in Pakistan to do something else, to produce something else. So it's a part and components, it's fuels, it's machinery and equipment. So this type of things. So there is no country in the world that has moved to an medium upper level of income that has done so by restricting imports. Because you need the imports to be able to produce what you need, but also you need imports to consume. And variety is good and variety is appreciated. So the challenge is not so much whether imports are good or bad, or whether we should make a decision between imports and exports. So imports are needed to export. And that false opposition is to be dropped from the discourse. And rather than thinking about limited imports, what we need to do is we need to think about how are we going to finance those imports? How are we going to pay for those imports? And the way to pay for those imports is, either you export more or you attract investment to pay for that. And I think this is in line with what Chandana was saying when you asked her about the current account deficit, right? If you bring enough foreign direct investment, that will finance your current account deficit. If you don't bring foreign direct investment and you still run a current account deficit, then that's a challenge. So what I would say is a successful case of import-led growth, well, let's turn that question around and think, if we want to have a successful case of export-led growth, we need to let imports in, but at the same time, lift all barriers that the country has on export, so that we can pay for those imports. And those barriers are mainly productivity being stagnant, access to finance being a challenge, lack of export intelligence provisions to firms, and challenges with branding that are creating problems for exporters in services, in manufacturing, to find new clients elsewhere. So I'm going to be brief now in the interest of time. So that's all I wanted to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Chandana. What efforts should be undertaken to enhance understanding of parliamentarian key?
Thank you, Reba. As I understood, we had two questions, no, on parliamentarians' capacity and capability. Am I correct?
Ms. Chandana?
Yes, yes. If you will recall, Ariba, just for my understanding, there were two questions on parliamentarians. One was on what efforts should be undertaken to enhance understanding of parliamentarians, and also why can't we have a meaningful debate in the parliament on budget or trade policy of Pakistan? Am I
Precisely.
correct? So
Correct.
if it's all right with you, I'd like to take them both together because they highlight different dimensions of the political paradigms we
Sure.
seem to face. Is that okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, firstly, as I said, I'm a new convert to politics. I'm a parliamentarian. Yes, I don't know yet if I'm a politician. I'm definitely a technocrat. We'll see how that goes. We've still got 3 more years in our basket. Coming from a trade background, the reason I joined this party was because the current prime minister was looking for technocrats, in particular women, and in particular from KP and Balochistan. So let's just say that at least I saw intent in this particular prime minister to ensure that we have right people, right kind of people on board to ensure that budget, that your parliament, people who enter parliament can actually talk about the things that they're supposed to. Now, there's a difference between elected MNAs and reserve MNAs, whether you're minorities or whether you're women. The reason they bring in minorities and women like me is because people tend not to vote for technocrats. People prefer to vote for those people who visit the constituency, i.e. non-technocrats. Now, that is where the base problem comes in. You have populist governments, popular candidates versus technocrats. And that's been a plague for India, Pakistan, all governments in the developing world. So part of the problem lies in the structure that we have. Democracy is not supposed to elect technical people. Democrats are supposed to elect popular people. We'll go for funerals, we'll go to the weddings, we'll speak for the people. And that is why you don't have necessarily balanced discussions in parliament, because people are keen to ensure that their constituents hear them speak about things that the constituents care about. Constituents don't care about microeconomic policy. What constituents want is water, electricity, jobs, gas, power, schools, hospitals. So, which is why your budget debates will always be of a low quality, with a few given exceptions, unless you talk about agriculture or you talk about jobs, because people don't understand. And it's only fair. You've got a country where your literacy rate is pretty low. And then you've got a country where your employment rates, even before COVID, were not the best. For the last 40 years, we've not had a strong industrial policy. In fact, zero industrial policy at the federal level for the last 13 years, 14 years. So you've created a country, pardon my French, you've deliberately dumbed it down. There's a book called Dumbing America Down, but we've done this to our country. We want our constituents to not be smart so they don't question us on the difficult things. And that is an unfortunate political dimension of it. Now, whether our party can bring that difference remains to be seen. At the end of 5 years, you'll see if we've made a qualitative difference. Quantitatively, we're always going to remain the same. But to change the quality, you also need to change the mindset of your populace. And that's the hardest thing I have to do. I mean, since your question was very specific about parliamentarians' performance during the budget and the quality of the debate, but the problem is much wider than that. And I've experienced, as I said, I'm not an elected member, I'm a reserve member, so I don't have to ask anyone for a vote, and I don't have to pander to anybody's baser discussions. But I can tell you that the pandemic was a test for me as well, because during the lockdown, my constituents couldn't care less about the pandemic. They would reduce because they come from two different backgrounds. They come either from agriculture or the construction industry. And they said this lockdown is for the rich people of Pakistan who can afford 6 months groceries and basic medical supplies. We can't do that. You've reduced us to beggars. And so that is the problem. What they don't understand is we are trying to save the economy, save them, and save ourselves from the pandemic, where their interests are very singular. So parliamentarians, unfortunately, work on those singular interests. And that is how they win elections. So there has, and which is why you see a huge team of technocrats in the Prime Minister's team working with him, is because while you will have populist leaders in the parliament, you need those technical people to ensure that both the long-term, medium, and short-term problems are resolved. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Shafiq. Is our exporting industry ready for a fourth industrial revolution? What steps are being taken at the Ministry of Commerce in this regard?
Big question on the performance of Ministry of Commerce and other government, all departments as well. Are we ready for the industrial revolution? You see, what are the drivers for industrial revolution? What drives countries towards this industrial revolution? There are generally 3-4 major drivers which are considered to be the major ingredient for any country to move towards that path, and then of course become exporting country to that level. One is the information and communication infrastructure. Do we have that infrastructure? Yes, we are. We say that broadband network increasing, mobile users increasing, but still a lot to be done. What we generally say, Internet of Things or Internet of services, of energy, are we really geared up for that? Not yet. The other one, education and training. Yes, we say that there are, Madam Shamim may be in a position to highlight that we do have a lot of, we say that we have a huge qualified IT skilled labor force, but still when I see Indians and IT graduates are highly paid in India, but in case of Pakistan, this is not the case. So you create graduates, but where are they actually been working? Is there space for them to accommodate and create so many jobs for the IT skilled labor force? The other one is innovation, product design, technology, upgradation. Despite many policies announced by different ministries and Ministry of Commerce, we are still lagging far behind. As Mr. Sadiq Saab said, even in case of textiles, we are only on the extreme lower bottom of even textile production. Then policy innovation we need for that, your legislative reforms, institutional reforms, and then product context specific policies. So these are the drivers. But posing this question that what ministry is doing, these are all drivers are spread out. Some with one ministry, some with the other, and some lying with the other. And as we have been saying that we are not pursuing a whole of the government approach. The policies are not very well organized, not connected with each other. Until unless we connect all these dots, all these ministries, departments, some dedicated to provinces and some the other ones, until unless they sit down and phrase their policy. Do we have the industrial policy? Not yet. I was reading the other day that even the European Commission has announced their industrial policy, which is specific to address this industrial 4 revolution. Why can't we have that policy? So I think that there are gaps at the government level, at the ministries level, which we need to address. Bits and pieces, we have addressed these challenges. We have announced, this digital Pakistan policy, which was announced in 2018, telecom policy announced in 2015. So maybe we then announce policies that are they really context specific policies and aim to address the challenges that Pakistan is facing. Until unless we pursue that, I am afraid that we'll not be able to, at least move on this chapter. Thank you.
Next question is for Shamim. So considering COVID and a strong move towards tech, do you see the industry growing rapidly in Pakistan? And what else can accelerate the pace? What policy measures would you suggest to improve Pakistan's IT exports?
So yeah, thank you, Ariba, again. So yeah, definitely considering COVID and post-COVID, what I've seen, first of all, is that, so as we are coming out of COVID, the most biggest lesson that we've learned is that crises like these are a moment for innovation. So what we've seen in the tech domain is that sectors like telemedicine, online education, e-commerce, cybersecurity are all taking skyrocketing. So that is very heartwarming to see. How the industry can grow rapidly, again, what policy measures can be taken? First and foremost, our biggest burn is the budget. So please allocate a respectable budget for the software export. What I hear from the breakdown that I saw earlier on is that if you talk specifically about the software export, budget for 2020, it is 40 million at this point, which is very, very small. My numbers might be wrong, but this is what I got. Measures should be taken to improve on that. So the other thing that I think which will help the industry grow rapidly is giving incentives on taxes to the software industry. Now, I know that the software industry has a tax holiday, and we're very grateful for that for on exports. Going back to what Donna Saiba was saying about tax cuts and how Sindh is charging double, let me just give you a very brief idea on that. And what we're fighting against is that the federal charges 5% GST, PRA charges almost 16%, and 5% on now they're charging for online services. SRB, Sindh is on the other hand charging 13%. And since still also charging all call centers, despite the fact that the federal isn't, because the definition to what ITES stands for does not match with the FBR's definition. So those are areas that if they're improved and proper tax cuts are given, that could definitely help the industry move forward. Another incentive that we are very, hoping to get from the public sector, from the government, is 5% cashback incentive for export. This was a promise that was made a couple of years ago. It's still, so the mechanism still needs to be rolled out for that. So waiting to see if that can be possible. Other thing that the government can work, and the SBP is again working towards that, but we don't see anything happening on ground, is loans against intangible assets. So loans against software contracts and soft collaterals. So that is not happening. If that can be pushed more towards the intermediary bank and holding them accountable to do that, that would really help. Giving utilities tax relaxation, so like tax relaxations on internet and all that would really help. But that's for the government. But some of the other things that I really want to focus on is on a bigger scale or on a wider horizon, apart from just talking about tax and tax cuts, is promoting the Make in Pakistan brand. So again, like I said earlier on, public-private partnerships are very important. So for international and government tenders, government organizations should partner with private sectors instead of creating own business ventures, like in the case of NITB. And if you really want to promote the small and medium enterprises, and again, I'm talking with regard to the tech sector, 30% of all these public projects or IT-related public projects should be procured from the SMEs themselves, and the SMEs should be trained. So one of the things that I've seen is that SMEs tend to shy away from applying for these projects is because they don't have the right kind of training. So giving them training to apply for these tenders and would actually help. Again, going back to creating the right kind of skill sets. Again, the other thing that I would emphasize more, and I think it needs a lot of emphasis, is into introducing more initiatives to open the global market to the local tech industry. Show a better face of Pakistan and give incentives to for the international players to come to Pakistan, and similar incentives to Pakistani local industry to participate in the trade shows globally. So I think that's some of the incentives. If we can at least pick up on some of these, especially the Make in Pakistan brand, the skill development, the tax cuts, I think for me, the IT industry has a lot of potential. Not saying this because I belong to the IT industry, but saying this as a Pakistani and as a person who is been in the services side for a very long time and just started my entrepreneurship journey. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is for Dr. Adil. What policy measures and firm-level practices can enhance Pakistan's productivity to gain comparative advantage in the international markets?
Okay, thank you, Ariba, for this question. Yeah, this is a very good question. So let me first touch upon the firm-level practices that I believe are essential in enhancing firm competitiveness in international markets. So my suggestions will mostly pertain to new and potential exporters, right? So I'll start with this. So apart from participation in trade fairs and exhibitions, which is essential for all businesses, export market intelligence is critical for exporters and sets the stage up for exporting. What I believe is that exporters must have information regarding the potential market size of selected export destinations, but must also be fully aware of the economic and political conditions prevailing in their targeted destination markets. It's very important to have that information, to tap into these resources, which something like the Economics Intelligence Unit, etc., that tell you about the markets that you're trying to target. And even looking up the international trade centers, trademap.org will give you a lot of information about the potential size of your exports. So undertaking research at the earlier stages of exporting, right, pre-exporting stages rather than at later stages of exporting can help exporters. And the other point is that firms must know about the quality of their products and the conformity assessments, right, that we have mentioned, based on the standards and quality checks imposed by potential trading partners. So what generally happens is a lot of these producers, these are potential or new entrants, they don't know about the requirements, and suddenly they find that their consignments that they have sent into the import market has been rejected by the border officials because they did not meet certain standard and quality assessment requirements, and they then report a loss on their whole consignment due to that. Right? We hear about some mangoes being exported and they had some issues, and the whole consignment of all exporters related to that can get banned. So this happened in the seafood industry, I think, about a few years ago, where they reported a significant loss to their exports to EU because some of the exporters did not meet the requirements that they had imposed here on them. So although this information should be readily available, the onus still lies on the exporters, and it is their job to find out more about them. Now let me come to the government side policies to boost productivity. So ensure that firms have access to all types of inputs, domestic or imported. This is actually very important, and Gonzalo has quite a few times mentioned that they require, and that at globally competitive price. So firms should have access to those inputs that they need, right? Innovation in production and process is tied to the ability of firms to get the best, procure the best inputs at the cheapest possible price within the quickest possible time possible. Therefore, import policy must ensure that firms have not only easier access to inputs, the prices are globally competitive, and the time delay in getting the goods from the ports to the factory is reduced. Although, so my recommendation itself could be a bit ambitious, but small steps, right, are needed, and they could include adoption of digital technologies for trade facilitation and improving the communication between exporters and various trade officers you have around the world. Now, the government must enhance the role of SMEs in exporting. This is highly critical, that SMEs need to become more proactive in this, and that role of SMEs needs to be more important. Unfortunately, exporting activities in Pakistan are limited to large firms. Top 1% of exporters ranked in terms of their export sales dominate 60% of textile exports, 67% of leather and hide exports, and 40% of prepared food exports. So this is highly unequally distributed towards those large exporters. The top 1% exporters with their in-house capabilities and access to funds typically export multiple products to multiple destinations, and they're able to do that because they have the export market intelligence. They have a lot of departments that are working, and they even have buying houses in or agreements with buying offices even in foreign countries that are setting up a lot of export orders for them, which these small SMEs don't have. So again, this is mainly due to high, so one of the things is that smaller exporters are usually stuck with exporting to a single destination market with limited potential. Again, this is mainly due to high fixed costs associated with entering new markets and introducing new products. Unfortunately, the top exporters are highly concentrated within the textile industry. So again, we see that textile industry is dominated by the large exporters, and they are mostly concentrated in that. The role of SMEs is again crucial in export diversification, and they can play a very important role. And it all depends on their ability to generate information on their potential markets, and that's what's important, right? So, and the SMEs can play a very important part in participating in global value chains. Now, to close, let me point out a major menace that has hurt competitiveness of Pakistani producers and is tied to the high tariff culture prevalent in the country. It results in inefficiencies as well as misreporting, right? So the government must eliminate the curse of under-invoicing and misinvoicing rampant in Pakistan. Now, this is again a result of high tariff rates on products that is more effective for the importer to under-declare the volume of imports than pay taxes on it. So this is what happens. So the government is not able to generate revenue because it has posed such a high tariff on those products that the importers are misdeclaring or under-invoicing, right? Again, we need digital solutions to take care of this menace because this is resulting in uncompetitive practices. And again, we need effective border controls for that. So a lot of these things come up, and I'll close my, with this, I'll end my answer. And thank you again for this question.
Thank you, Adil. Thank you, Ariba. So we'll have the fourth round of our session. We are running out of time. And what we'll do, I'll only pick 3 to 4 questions from participants. And I'll be, requesting the panelists to answer to those questions briefly so that we can conclude this session in next 10 to 15 minutes. So the first question is, Musaddiq, for you, that one of our colleagues has mentioned that there is a difference in input cost, especially labor and energy, between Bangladesh and Pakistan. So what do you think about that? But we generally believe that the cost of labor and energy is higher in Pakistan as compared to Bangladesh. And in this situation, how can Pakistan compete with Bangladesh in the international market?
Well, I think, thank you for that question. Yes, on energy, I think our costs are higher. I don't think there is a need to subsidize the exporting industry, but what needs to be done is that we are overloaded by the inefficiencies of other discos, where there is a lot of theft and there is lesser collection, their receivables, and that they are overloaded to levelize the tariff to everybody else. While the big industries, you see, they are single point consumers, and they have to pay for the inefficiencies of the system. We are 30 to 40% more expensive in certain cases from Bangladesh and other countries, and I think that needs to be addressed. As far as the labor is concerned, I think we need to, we have to train them. It has to be a partnership between the private sector and the government, where we train our people. The Punjab government had a program with the international agency, which was run very effectively during the last few years, where they subsidize, they pay half the stipend, and half the stipend is borne by the industries, and youngsters are trained, skill developed, and then they are inducted into the industry. I think we had spoken to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Commerce that this needs to be expanded on the countrywide scale, on a large scale. That has to be done. One thing which rather two things which I would like to point out and then stop, because I think there are other questions pending. One is that Bangladesh has overwhelming female employment in the garment industry, which is a huge difference. It creates a huge difference. I think Shamim also pointed out that our diversity factor in Pakistan is very low. Part of it is because of the culture we have adopted gradually, although Bangladesh should have the same culture. Part of it is because of the government regulation. In Pakistan, you are not allowed to have women working in the night shifts. Whereas under the Factories Act, you have to rotate the shift workers. You can't have just men in the night shift. So that needs to be addressed. Safety of the women has to be addressed. I think that can. The other thing which I said I will point out is that even from the point of view of the manufacturers and the entrepreneurs, we tend to think that whatever we save from labor is our profits. I think we need to invest more on our people, to pay them the right wages, to pay them the right overtime, to take care of them so that they feel loved and they give you more. We think that if we can pay them less and less, or we can just pay them what is prescribed, probably we'll save more. I think that's the wrong approach. We have to give them more. We have to take care of them. We have to take care of their families. We have to respect them. We have to train them. And that's how you can get more out of them, if they feel that they're working for their own company rather than working for a state. So these are the things which I think make a difference. And that's how we differentiate from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Shafiq, next question is for you. That there was a question, probably it was about withdrawal of zero rating of exporting sectors in last year budget, and I think this is still maintained. There was a question, what do you think, how has it impacted Pakistan's exports, and what is government's stance to continue of this withdrawal of GST, zero GST regime for exporting sectors?
Thank you so much. You see, we have to see that why government was forced to withdraw this facility. This facility was available to the exporters for last many years. And FBR in particular was of the view that this facility might have contributed to exports, but this is being misused as well. So they withdrew this facility and introduced a new system of, payment of refunds, the faster system. Now the problem is that that system would work only once these exporters are registered with that system. Now registration is difficult. They have their own views regarding registration, but I think the Ministry of Commerce, by the way, took a position on that since the majority of the exporters are of the view that this will impact our exports, so government should continue with this zero rating facility. But FBR took a firm position on that, and then of course Ministry of Commerce had to concede to FBR's point of view. And I don't think so there is any consideration at this moment to withdraw to restore this facility. The government will continue with that, and even if we are saying that we are moving away from taxes on imports, the government has to generate more taxes, and then as a result they feel that this policy should be in place. But on the other side, FBR must make efforts for effective and early refund of the funds stuck up of the exporters. Some funds have been released in this budget, but until unless we put in place an alternative effective mechanism for this facility, the exporters of course will keep on saying that it must be restored, but I think it is not going to happen in the current circumstances.
Okay, so thank you. Chandana, we have a question for you, and that is actually building on the same question that Ariba asked you about having debate in the parliament about budget and trade issues. So there is general discussion in Pakistan. Why don't we have a political consensus on some key economic issues? And I personally think that this trade competitiveness is a matter of survival for the country in many ways. So is there a possibility that we can have a political consensus on trade-related laws, measures, and policies? So how do you see it, particularly when every political party also comes from a different ideological lineage and additional ideological stances as well on trade and economy?
Thank you, Naveed sir. Couple of points of view here, because that's not one question, there's a few questions. For starters, I can also actually see the question in our sidebar. There's a question on the Charter of Democracy between parties. I don't know if you had a look at that. And it's a very interesting question in that I think there's a gentleman who has, Muhammad Usman Khalid, he's mentioned the same thing. He's talked about a Charter of Democracy. If we could have that, why can't we have a Charter of Economy for framing a policy for the next 40 years? He's also talked about the potential of youth in agriculture. So I think I'll take all of these together and perhaps explain the political background as I understand it. First problem is that we're in a particular time frame right now. This is not the pandemic. If you'll recall, the predecessor to the current National Accountability Bureau was the Ehtisab Bureau. Ehtisab Bureau was framed when there was a military dictatorship, an ex-military officer who then became the head of the state. And as you well know, then the 18th Amendment came in. There can be no longer any usurpation of powers of the civilian elected government, no matter how corrupt or bad your rulers are. It's a choice between one or the other. But if the people have a will, that must be respected. Elected people must be allowed to complete their mandates, elected governments. Now, that is your basic thinking. Unfortunately, the NAB law was used in the last 10 years for political victimization, often based on reality, but used in such a way. So I really can't get up and say, you, Gonzalo, you're going to have a NAB case against you, simply because Gonzalo doesn't work for the government and he has, as far as we know, nothing to answer for. But Shafiq Saab, that's a different story altogether. He's disappeared from here. And so NAB was used to grab onto people who had dubious transactions, but it wasn't done because it was done in the to favor the country. It was done to settle scores. So that was a pity. Unfortunately, that's been done for scores of years for the Criminal Procedure Code, the Civil Procedure Code, the Pakistan Penal Code. So NAB operated on the same methodology. Now, when you've actually got a government that is neither one or the other, who was doing it against each other, you've got currently a government which is investigating its own people. If I could just bring in politics for a second, you've got the sugar, IPP, wheat, in addition to the petroleum mafia. I think they try to take stay in the High Court yesterday against a commission which is investigating the OMCs. I use these strong words for a reason. And the reason is that, unfortunately, every political party has friends within friends, and they all have access to the highest policy makers. These cartels and mafias have not popped up in the last 6 months or a year. They've been there for a very long time. They've been allowed to fester. So when you have a setup like that, it's very difficult to do a charter of economy, because once you talk about something which we've done in this budget already, we have rationalized our subsidies. Ideally, in a poor developing country, you shouldn't have subsidies for the richest. You should have subsidies for the poorest. And yet we continue to subsidy the richest in this country on one pretext or the other. But because they're so strongly entrenched in the system of production, let's put it that way. I don't want to take the name of one particular organization where all the policies come from the STPF, that it is difficult. They have over the years positioned themselves so strongly in the system that if you don't subsidize them, your entire value chain of the economy will fall down and people will lose jobs. So we're slowly, this is the first time we've done this. We've rationalized the subsidies. We will do it further in the next couple of years, in particular for those industries that don't need those subsidies. I know one particular industry that takes 4 different subsidies at 4 different stages of production. They have a freight subsidy, they have a minimum income support price, they have a distribution subsidy, they have an export subsidy, as well as having an RD on that particular product's import. So the reason we can't have, it's a very long response to a short question, we can't have a charter of economy is because once it starts hurting my brother, your sister, your uncle, my brother, then the discussion drops. That is the reality of it. Asad Umar Saab, when he was Minister for Finance, he tried to have a very active committee on finance in the National Assembly. We have some very good speakers there. You have Nafisa Shah, Hina Rabbani Khar, Naveed Qamar, and this I'm talking about the opposition. You have some very strong people, Aisha Pasha, who have tried to revive a charter of economy, but I said the practical problem comes. If you recall last year when we were taking away the when we were imposing a 17% sales tax on those 5 sectors of the export-oriented economy that do domestic sales as well, there was a huge pushback that why would you tax somebody who exports? Well, we're not taxing their exports, we're taxing their domestic sales. And if you're going to tax all domestic industry, why do you have a carve-out for these 5? These are your 5 most successful export sectors. You can't be telling me that a sector which is supposed to pay 34 billion is paying 6 billion and we're saying that's fine. No, that's not. That's a 2-year tax and everybody has to pay. So that is, as I said, that is my problem with the private sector. But I understand that, of course, the private sector is not here for charity. They have to do business. And if they've gotten, as I would say, illegal tax breaks in the past, it's time to stop that. We need to streamline. Give your taxes to your SMEs. Give tax breaks to SMEs. Give it to IT sector. Give tax breaks to those companies that are in their niche sector, not that have been successful exports for the last 10, 15, 20 years. You have to stop the squeezing. You will never become a Turkey or a Chile if you continue to do this. Final point on the issue of dairy sector. You're aware that the Prime Minister had an agriculture emergency program. The Speaker has a specific committee called the Special Committee on Agriculture Products. We talk to the provinces, as you know, the agriculture, food, labor, youth, these are all provincial issues. So we're actively interfering in provincial politics because we found we had all these people come and meet us, youth, women, farmers, that nobody listens to us. There's no committee for farmers, there's no committee for youth, there's no committee for women, and the provinces have not yet gotten their act together in this particular issue, and that includes the provinces where we have a government. So what we've done is we're actively talking to these 3 different sectors, lobbies, whatever you call them. We're coming up with a supplement to the Prime Minister's Agriculture Emergency Program from the Speaker's Committee that's going to go through the MNFSR, the Ministry of National Food Security, and this proposal will be presented to the private sector. It's not going to be a part of the budget because we don't have that kind of money right now. But we're trying to do things out of the box. We're trying to do structural reforms in backward, as you say, backward movement. So we're going to have a reverse engineering sort of model with 7-year plan, 3-year plan, 1-year plan. And in that, we're trying to do things that the budget and the provinces are already doing, but in some sense, we're the big brother watching them, because we've got about 10 industries, the provinces, the private sector, and we need to shake this foundation. So for youth, for dairy, all of this, we're doing that. We've got the private sector on board, we've got investors on board, we've got foreigners on board. So this cannot be, the reason I say this here is because it's not public yet, but we have a lot of public consultation on this. So on the question to this young gentleman who asked, we are doing this to the best of our ability, but it's very hard post 18th Amendment. Thank you.
Gee, thank you. I think it's quite detailed and interesting, insights about this critical process in the country. So Gonzalo, I don't know how much you've been studying e-commerce, recent rise in Pakistan and what sort of barriers e-commerce is facing. So there was a question about, payment gateway, PayPal, or lack of other financing channels. So along with financing, can you tell us about what is the future of e-commerce in Pakistan? And what are some of the policy measures that we should rethink to promote e-commerce in the country?
Well, e-commerce is going to boom, right? It's booming already, and it's going to boom even more globally. So Pakistan should certainly embrace e-commerce. It is very promising that there is an e-commerce framework, and there is a policy that is being implemented by the government of Pakistan. That's a very good thing. I think probably the main challenge with e-commerce is payments gateways, and this is what we see in many countries in the world that tend to impose some sort of restrictions to movement of capital that they make payments gateway more complicated to be operative. So if Pakistan soon sorts out the payments gateway issue, then I think this is going to make e-commerce a very powerful promotion platform for many firms in Pakistan. So for domestic commerce for sure, but also even for international trade. So what you would need there is a working payments gateway, first of all, and then second, logistics systems that are operative. So that is logistics is the other element that e-commerce, one thing about international trade requires. So if any so think of Khadi. I don't want to make publicity of companies here, but Khadi probably is one of the most renowned brands, and Khadi could be selling internationally if it has access to a system of logistics that allows transportation by air of its products directly to consumers. This is going to be a great opportunity for firms, and it's going to be a great opportunity also for Pakistani firms to build brands. So I think those two elements, the development of the logistics sector and the storing out for good of the payments gateway. And then let me say one more thing, and then I end with this. That is, and people are going to say that I'm obsessed with tariffs, but one thing that you need if you're going to use e-commerce for international trade is to have a system of returns, right? So say, for example, I order a shalwar kameez from Khadi, and then I try it on and it's too big. So I'm going to return it. So there must be a system that customs collectors use to deal with returns. This is another problem that we saw in many countries that when firms were embracing e-commerce, that they had issues with returns and how they were going to be treated by the tariff code. So this is something that needs to be tackled with too. So three things: logistics, tariffs for returns, and payments gateway, that I think is the largest, most important. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting to know these three steps. So Adil, this is last question for you. There was a question I should have asked someone representing the government, but I think we've already asked them questions. So there was a question that when this government came in power, they suppressed imports. And at that time, probably they didn't realize the unintended consequences of suppressing imports. So how do governments take such decisions and they don't think about such consequences, that they are going to have reduction in revenues, they are going to have reduction of or the cost of increasing cost of input to exporting sectors. So what you say about that decision that government took, and whether it was deliberate decision to suppress imports, or there was no other choice available to the government?
This is a highly, yeah, it's an interesting and I think a debatable thing, right? We were all debating about this. But now if you look at the, one of the things that happened was, what was the result of this suppressing of imports? It led to, yes, the trade deficit. The idea was, as Madam Chandana said, that was to first tackle the trade deficit, the rising trade. We had a trade deficit of $36 billion when this government came into power, and that needed to be tackled, brought down, because we did not have the money to finance it. We did not have at that time, we were highly in need of these foreign reserves, and we could not spend it on financing imports. But then again, the cost was that it brought inefficiencies, it lowered growth, all that, because our growth, our whole economy was running on those imports that were being imported. So there was this whole cycle, right? It's a very catch-22 situation here. At that time, the government, because it had to reduce, so it had to go for it. Now, the fallout was, naturally, you have a hit on the inputs. The inputs, you couldn't find that. Your exporters. Now, exports itself is based on a lot of inputs that you require, and they have to be easily accessible. You cannot export if you're not competitive. If you cannot attain your inputs competitively, you will likely then suffer. So how does China ensure that it's a very strong exporter? It gets its advantage by ensuring that its inputs that it gets from around the world through its, again, BRI initiative. That's why the BRI initiative is very important, is that it can get those inputs easily. It's making those investments in Africa, in Latin America, where it can get those inputs that it needs to produce. It's now going to send through this CPEC. One of the reasons for CPEC was, again, so that it could bolster its western side and bring factories where it had a chance to, again, lower production costs, because they say that the labor there is cheaper than the labor in the Eastern Seaboard. So again, this whole thing, the whole question comes up is that, but there's the other side to it now. Now, if you put high tariffs and if you start limiting your imports, even your finished goods, if you end up limiting those, it can cause a lot of inefficiencies here, because the problem is once you kick out competition, the fact that then there's an issue with the local inefficiencies. So local inefficient players who cannot be competitive in the world market but find space in the local market start. So again, there's this whole anti-export bias that comes in because you have put high tariffs on chocolates or whatever it is that you were once trying to export or trying to sell and be competitive in. So there's this whole trade-off that we have to really take care of. The urgent need there was definitely to reduce the trade deficit, but then we could have heard one of the reasons was that our local industries have become highly import dependent, and because of that, if you stop imports suddenly, they will be hurt. So again, it's a catch-22 situation. There is no clear answer. One way or the other, there is a cost to it, and it depends on what cost at that time is more important. So at that time, the government felt that deficit, the fine was much more critical than the fact that the inefficiencies we would face because of those imports. Restriction of imports, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Adil. Sheikh, I think you can, be held accountable whatever happened in Ministry of Commerce during the last 2 years. So would you like to respond to this question and the comment that Adil has made?
You see, Gonzalo and Adil pointed out about the imports. I mean, you cannot analyze or answer this question until and unless you see what actually were the imports which has gone down, or what were the tariff measures or other measures were taken by government to reduce imports. And we are saying that maybe this was one of the reasons that our exports are not picking up. To this hypothesis, I don't agree. You see, $3 to $4 billion imports just were restricted as the CPEC. There was a surge in imports from China. In 2014-15, imports from China were just 12 billion. In 17, they went up to 17 billion. So these $4-5 billion imports were primarily CPEC-related imports that includes machinery and other infrastructure, that was related to CPEC. So there was a natural compression since the CPEC first phase, early harvest, is over, and there was no, imports coming for energy projects and other infrastructure related projects, there was a dip in imports from China. One. Number two, what ministry actually or FBR took 3 major steps which reduced imports? One, the vehicle imports, import of second-hand cars was restricted. Now, did that actually impacted Pakistan's export industry? Not at all. That was actually the demand of the local manufacturers that the second-hand cars should be banned in order to enable them to create more market. And actually, they spent a lot of money on expansion, like Honda and Toyota. They expanded, their factories, but these and around import of around $500 million were just spent on these luxury cars. So we stopped that, and there was no need for that, to be honest. Third component was food items. Now, food items, we put stringent labeling requirements and SPS measures. And now, yes, they might have affected our, but that was a consumer product. It was applied on chips, it was applied on chocolates, it was applied on, Nutella, which is the high-end market, and it was the consumer products. They were not contributing to Pakistan's actually export industry or manufacturing sector. Number 4, the other one was food, luxury items. Yeah. And now luxury, our definition, you might disagree with me. What is luxury and what is a necessity? It depends on the class. But luxury items, which we generally see are the luxury items, yes, we restricted their imports. We did, yes, RD was imposed, regulatory duty, not the tariffs. So regulatory duty, that has also been reduced now in this budget, because we realized over the years that RD has not actually contributed to reduction in imports. Rather, the same products were coming back through Afghanistan. They were transiting, through Pakistan to Afghanistan and finding their way back to Pakistan's market. So RD has been reduced. So in this, my hypothesis is, yes, that might have affected, like hot rolled coils, HRC, there was an RD on that, which has also been reduced in this budget. So that's a raw material, yes. We need to rectify that, but saying that all imports, this import compression has actually led to reduction in exports, this is not actually the case. Another factor also contributed to reduction in imports was the trade. We restricted trade with India. So $2 billion, imports were coming from India. That's been, though we have diverted to some other sources, but we have generated some domestic capacity as well, like some of the chemicals and some. Yes, like cotton, you can say, was a raw material, which was coming, from India around, and other PTA was, the chemical product, which was coming from India. That's the raw material, but that's an accidental, measure taken by Pakistan in response to what India did. So my hypothesis is that, yes, they might have, but actually the objective was to contain current account deficit, and that was taken, very well crafted, well advised, and well researched policy of restricting those imports which were not contributing actually to the growth of manufacturing sector in Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Shfiq. I think that's well explained by you, and thanks to all panelists. It was an amazing session. I learned a lot, and I hope our participants have also learned a lot. And I would also like to thank all participants for joining us, especially the last 40 ones who stayed with us for 2.5 hours, I think. So thank you very much. And